Among mercenaries, there was an old saying, "A mercenary who doesn't die is considered third rate." The saying wasn't meant as an insult, it was simply the reality of their profession. Mercenaries were paid well because every contract came with the possibility of death. They fought where others wouldn't, took risks no sane person would accept, and survived through skill, luck, and sheer stubbornness. As those words echoed in Jake's mind, a grim battlefield stretched out before him. Swords were buried in the dirt, corpses littered the ground, and the smell of blood still lingered in the air. The war that had consumed the region was nearing its end, and not in the way anyone had hoped. Jake, captain of the Fang mercenaries, made his way toward a meeting with the commander-in-chief. Judging by the current state of the war, he already had a bad feeling about what was coming. The moment he locked eyes with the commander, he noticed the exhausted expression. The man looked as though he hadn't slept in days. After a long silence, the commander finally spoke. Tomorrow, the rebel army would launch their final assault. Their forces had suffered defeat after defeat, and there was no longer any chance of turning the war around. The Crawford family, once one of the most powerful noble houses in the region, had been pushed to the brink of destruction. Then the commander made a request so absurd that Jake couldn't help but laugh. The commander wanted Jake and the Fang mercenaries to remain behind and fight, not to win, not to survive, but simply to buy time. Time for Lord Lucian to escape. Jake stared at the commander in disbelief. The man knew exactly who he was dealing with. Mercenaries weren't knights. They didn't throw their lives away for honor, glory, or noble causes. They fought for survival and coin. Yet here he was asking them to die like heroes. The commander lowered his head and apologized, admitting that he had spoken emotionally. The situation had become desperate, and he was running out of options. Jake listened quietly, but his patience was already gone. In his mind, the war was over. If even a talented commander like this had been cornered so completely, there was no hope left. Then the commander held out something, a massive gemstone. Even under the dim light, the jewel sparkled brilliantly. Its value was obvious. With something like that, the Fang mercenaries could live comfortably for years. But instead of being tempted, Jake's expression darkened. He immediately understood what was happening. This wasn't payment. It was bait. The commander wasn't simply asking them to fight, he was asking them to become sacrifices. The Fang mercenaries had built a fearsome reputation over the years. They specialized in dirty warfare, infiltration, assassinations, and impossible missions. Many rebel officers had died by their hands. The rebels hated them. If the Fang mercenaries appeared on the battlefield, every enemy soldier would focus on killing them. And while the rebels were distracted, Lord Lucian could escape unnoticed. The commander had chosen them as the perfect decoy. Realizing this, Jake's anger boiled over. He had believed this commander was different from the other nobles. Instead, he turned out to be exactly the same. Worse, perhaps, because he knew precisely what he was asking. Surprisingly, the commander didn't defend himself. He simply apologized once more, a genuine apology. But Jake wasn't interested. An apology wouldn't save his men. For a moment, Jake even considered killing the commander and delivering his head to the rebels in exchange for freedom. The commander calmly asked if Jake truly intended to do that. Jake smirked. If it meant saving his men, he absolutely would. Unfortunately, both of them knew it wasn't that simple. The commander had already anticipated every possible betrayal. There was no easy escape left. As the conversation continued, Jake found himself thinking about the men who followed him. The Fang mercenaries weren't just subordinates. They were people who had trusted him, people born in poverty who had followed him in search of a better future. He had promised them that they could rise above their circumstances, that they could achieve something greater. And because of that, he carried a responsibility that couldn't be abandoned now. If one life had to be sacrificed to save the rest, then he had already made his decision. The commander studied him silently. Then he spoke. That was what it meant to be a leader. The room suddenly grew tense. Both men understood that words had reached their limit. In an instant, the commander moved. Jake barely had time to react before steel flashed through the air. The battle had begun. Jake immediately drew his weapon and charged forward. Sparks flew as their swords collided. At first, he tried to gain momentum through aggression, launching attack after attack. But with every exchange, reality became more obvious. The commander was far stronger than him. His movements were precise, efficient, overwhelming. Every strike carried enough force to push Jake backwards. Jake gritted his teeth and continued fighting. He knew he couldn't win. That wasn't the point. Somewhere outside, his men were already escaping. Every second he remained standing increased their chances of survival. The commander attacked again. Jake blocked. The impact rattled his entire body. Another strike followed, then another. Soon blood was running down his face, his breathing grew heavier, his muscles screamed in protest, yet he refused to stop. Even as the gap between them became impossible to ignore, Jake kept fighting. Because this was the responsibility he had chosen, a captain's duty. As the battle dragged on, a strange thought entered his mind. What if things had been different? What if he had been born into a noble family? What if he had received the same education, training, and opportunities as the commander? How far could he have gone? Would he have become a great knight? A famous general, a hero remembered throughout history? Unfortunately, he would never know. The world around him began to fade. His vision darkened. The battlefield disappeared. The sounds of combat vanished. Eventually, there was nothing left but darkness. Jake felt himself sinking deeper and deeper into the void. Then he heard something, a voice. At first, it was distant and unclear, almost impossible to make out. But gradually, it grew louder. Someone was calling to him. The darkness cracked apart. Light flooded into his vision. A hand grabbed his shoulder and shook him. Jake slowly opened his eyes. The battlefield was gone. The commander was gone. Everything was different. A young servant was kneeling beside him, desperately trying to wake him up. The boy looked relieved the moment he saw Jake's eyes open. Then he shouted, "Young Master Lucian." Jake froze for a moment. He couldn't understand what he had just heard. Young Master Lucian? As realization slowly began to dawn on him, Jake understood that something impossible had happened. The mercenary captain who had died on the battlefield was gone, and somehow he had awakened in the body of Lord Lucian himself. A red-haired servant boy named Hans is kneeling beside the bed, slapping his cheek in a panic. The protagonist is confused by the boy's frantic behavior and the unfamiliar surroundings. But most importantly, he knows with certainty that he died. He remembers it clearly. He was killed so thoroughly that no one could have saved him. Yet here he is with his head still attached. He reasons through the situation calmly and reaches the only logical conclusion. He has entered the body of a complete stranger. When he catches his reflection in a window, he sees a strikingly handsome young man with golden hair and sharp features. He calls out to Hans and asks a simple question. "What year is it?" Hans, assuming his master is still groggy, answers that it is Imperial Year 846. The protagonist is stunned. That is 15 years before the day he died. He has been sent back to the past. He steadies himself quickly, refusing to be overwhelmed. He turns the situation around and interrogates Hans coldly, demanding to know who he is. Hans, terrified and bowing to the floor, reveals the answer. His name is Lucian Valdek, the third son of the great House Valdek. The protagonist recognizes the name immediately. He knows the Valdek family well, because 15 years ago, in his previous life as a low-born mercenary, he worked as a guard at their estate for several years. He finds the irony darkly amusing. In his first life, he was humiliated constantly because of his low status, forced to endure every indignity while watching nobles live lives of power and privilege. Now, impossibly, he has been handed exactly the kind of opportunity he was always denied. He decides without hesitation that he will use it. He will climb as high as he possibly can and live on his own terms this time. He gets dressed and begins walking through the grand halls of the Valdek mansion. The estate is enormous and breathtaking, the most splendid place he has ever seen, even in a lifetime of traveling. He immediately notices, however, that the servants are all watching him strangely, whispering and stealing glances from the corners of their eyes. When he asks Hans about it, Hans explains that it is only natural, since Lucian had shut himself away in his room for a year and 2 months without meeting anyone but Hans. The protagonist is baffled that the real Lucian spent over a year alone in seclusion, but he files it away and keeps moving. He knows one critical piece of information about this household. The Grand Duke himself, Grand Duke Sigmund, the Iron Pillar of the Empire and one of the most powerful men in the land, lives here. A man like that would not simply ignore his own son wasting away in a room for over a year, which means either Lucian was such a problem child he had already been abandoned, or there is some special circumstance the protagonist does not yet understand. Either way, he resolves to avoid the Grand Duke until he figures out what is going on. Before he can retreat, however, he is intercepted by the head butler Edwin, a silver-haired, sharp-eyed man, introduced as Grand Duke Sigmund's right arm. Edwin had originally come to the mansion as a child hostage from a rival family, but rose through sheer ability to become the man who runs every aspect of the Valdek household. He is, in short, exactly the kind of person who would immediately see through someone pretending to be Lucian. The protagonist panics internally but thinks fast. Since Edwin has not seen Lucian in over a year either, he decides to impersonate him by basing his behavior on the most noble-like person he ever knew from his previous life. He pulls it off. He greets Edwin with warmth and poise, mentions that he has recovered well and came out specifically to check on family affairs, and smoothly asks whether anything has gone wrong in the household. Edwin, visibly relieved and happy, assures him that the Valdec family is doing well as always. The protagonist wraps up the conversation gracefully and turns to leave, feeling like the encounter went perfectly. Then Edwin stops him. Edwin tells him quietly that there is someone who wishes to see him right now. Lucian is led down a darkened corridor to a massive study. Inside, seated behind an enormous desk on what might as well be a throne, is Grand Duke Sigmund himself, a huge, scarred, imposing older man radiating authority and danger. The room is thick with oppressive silence. The Grand Duke finally speaks, addressing him directly as Lucian Valdec. Then he looks up, one glowing golden eye cutting through the shadow, and asks one question. Why are you alive? Lucian stared at the Grand Duke in confusion. How are you still alive? The question caught him completely off guard. The Grand Duke continued speaking, clearly furious. I intended to overlook it. He explained that he had tolerated Lucian's behavior for a long time, excusing it as the actions of a spoiled and troubled child. But now, Lucian had crossed the line. For more than a year, he had isolated himself and caused problems within the family. And now, it appeared that he had even attempted to take his own life. Lucian froze. Only then did he begin to understand the misunderstanding. The Grand Duke believed Lucian had intentionally overdosed on sleeping pills. Inside his head, Lucian desperately tried to piece together the memories of the original owner of this body. Suddenly, it clicked. This body belonged to Lucian Waldeck, the third son of the Grand Duke Waldeck family. Memories from 15 years ago surfaced. The current head of the family, Grand Duke Sigmund Waldeck, had multiple sons from different mothers. Lucian's mother had died early due to illness, and not long after Lucian himself had become isolated from the rest of the family. At first glance, it looked like a tragic but ordinary situation, but there was more to it than that. Lucian's mother had held an unstable position within the household. After her death, the young Lucian had been left alone to endure the harsh politics of a noble family. The sleeping pills hadn't been part of a suicide attempt at all. The original Lucian had simply been taking them for years. But his body had grown so weak that it eventually couldn't withstand the effects any longer. As the memories settled, Lucian realized something terrifying. The Grand Duke wasn't simply angry. He was acting like a father who had nearly lost his son. For a moment, Lucian almost felt guilty. Then reality hit him. This isn't the time to worry about someone else's feelings. His future was hanging by a thread. The Grand Duke's words sounded less like anger and more like a final judgment. Lucian could practically hear cracks forming in his dream of a comfortable future. One wrong answer could ruin everything. At best, he might be sent away to live as a priest in some remote monastery. At worst, he could be exiled to a freezing northern territory and spend the rest of his life suffering among snowfields and monsters. No way. He had only just received a second chance at life. There was no way he would let someone else's family drama destroy it. Taking a deep breath, Lucian finally spoke. Since you told me to speak honestly, I will. He admitted that he had brought shame upon the Waldeck name. He admitted that his actions had caused concern for his father, and he accepted responsibility without making excuses. The Grand Duke listened in silence. Lucian continued, What has already happened cannot be changed. Therefore, instead of remaining tied to the past, I intend to live diligently for the future. Then he made a bold request, not to the Grand Duke, but to his father, as a father. Please offer me just one word of encouragement. The room fell silent. Lucian pressed forward, a child who sincerely repents before his parents should be embraced, and parents should welcome such a child. Wasn't that the natural duty between father and son? The servants watching nearby were stunned. The timid Lucian they knew would never have spoken like this. His entire demeanor had changed. The Grand Duke's eyes narrowed. How dare you raise your voice before me and lecture me about the duties of a parent? The atmosphere became suffocating. But inside, Lucian was celebrating. It worked. Rather than acting timid and submissive, he had challenged the Grand Duke head-on. That was exactly the kind of attitude someone like Sigmund Waldeck respected. The Grand Duke finally spoke again. It seems you've become quite brazen after coming back from the dead. Then he asked the question that would determine Lucian's future. Lucian Waldeck, what do you intend to do from now on? Without hesitation, Lucian answered, First, I'll fix this broken body. Then he revealed his goal. I intend to learn the sword properly. The response shocked everyone. The sword, you, even Lucian understood how ridiculous it sounded. His body was so weak that he resembled a paper doll. Still, he tried to sound confident. If I eat well and sleep diligently, won't it work out somehow? The Grand Duke actually smiled. You certainly have a way with words. Whether it was genuine determination or empty bravado, he said he would judge by watching Lucian's actions. Then he turned to the butler. Give him that again. The butler immediately bowed. Rather than empty words of encouragement, the Grand Duke believed that would be more useful. Lucian was left completely confused. What is that? Moments later, the answer arrived. And when Lucian saw it, he couldn't believe his eyes. An enormous monthly allowance. A ridiculous amount of money. His jaw practically hit the floor. So, this is how high nobles live. And the most shocking part, this wasn't some special reward. This was only a single month's allowance. Lucian immediately changed his tune. With this much money on the line, this is definitely worth a shot. The scene opens on a beautiful glass greenhouse filled with flowers, somewhere on the Valdeck estate grounds. Grand Duke Sigmund walks through it slowly with Edwin at his side. Edwin explains that this was the late Grand Duchess's most cherished place during her lifetime, and that the Grand Duke hasn't visited in a long while, but he came today because of young Master Lucian's change. Even though Lucian had fallen out of the Grand Duke's favor for a time, Edwin notes that since he is the blood of the woman the Grand Duke cherished most, he likely couldn't let him go so easily. Edwin calls the old Lucian, the one who locked himself away and wasted away in isolation, truly pathetic. The Grand Duke says nothing, only walks, looking distant. The Grand Duke continues reflecting on how Lucian used to be. He describes the boy as always fearful, rolling his eyes around like a wild animal, flinching at even the slightest raise of the Grand Duke's voice. He murmurs quietly that Lucian's attitude was so different from his mother. The Grand Duke had always assumed the only resemblance Lucian carried was her appearance. But today, for the first time, a different thought occurred to him. He wonders if perhaps he had been wrong about that. The Edwin asks what he means. The Grand Duke describes the moment Lucian looked straight into his eyes without hesitation. A resolute, confident bearing, not a trace of the fearful child he knew. The Grand Duke says it was a truly different appearance. Edwin adds with mild warmth that young Master Lucian had always been tender-hearted, so he simply hesitated more compared to the other young masters. After all, the young master carries the blood of the Grand Duke. Sigmund is quiet for a moment, then says simply, "That remains to be seen. The trials placed before that child from now on are things that can never be solved with just a few words." Edwin then raises a concern. He informs the Grand Duke that he has resumed the financial support that had been stopped for Lucian, but that circumstances had already led to the matter being leaked. Upon investigation, it appears the second young master, Jordi Valdeck, is involved. Furthermore, Jordi dismissed the headmaid who had been assisting the third young master and placed one of his own close associates in that position, clearly revealing an intent to keep Lucian in check. The Grand Duke says that Jordi is a capable child, but the problem is that his vessel is narrow. He understands Jordi has a deep resentment toward the third young master within the family, but it is too persistent. Edwin asks whether they should take separate measures against Jordi. The Grand Duke says no, do not intervene. He notes that it might be too hasty as the young master has only just started to take his first steps. It is a petty trick that wouldn't even have worried them if Lucian could manage himself properly. He adds that this is simply the price the third child pays for not coming to his senses over the past year. Then Sigmund's expression shifts slightly. He says it actually works out well. He wants to watch how that child handles this. If he can't manage it, there would be no reason to have expectations. Even if the blood of the Valdeck family becomes the key, opening the door must always be done by one's own hands. A lion is shown, bold, golden, standing at the edge of a cliff. A title card reads, "Opening the door must always be done by one's own hands." Several days pass. The servants whisper among themselves. How many days has it been since the young master locked himself in his room again? Has he returned to his old ways? Hans, however, knows differently. He is practically vibrating with excitement outside the door. It has been 3 days since the stopped support funds were reinstated. He reflects that given the strained relationship between Lucian and the Grand Duke, getting that meeting to go well must have taken tremendous courage. Now Lucian intends to move forward, even if it means turning his back on his old self entirely. His plan is to use the funds to completely overhaul Lucian's weak, damaged body, and to do that, he intends to brew an elixir. He has already gathered the tools, materials expensive enough that a typical son of a Grand Duke would never have touched them, and one very specific ingredient that only grows under moonlight, the moonlight herb, a rare plant whose common usage hasn't even been established yet in this era. He turns to Hans and tells him it is not too late. Go and buy up all the moonlight herb available. Hans, baffled but loyal, scrambles off. Lucian holds a small dried flower of the herb and thinks to himself that he may look like a madman right now. But in just 1 year from now, the price of moonlight herb will be 10 times what it is today. No, over 20 times. It will skyrocket beyond reason. He laughs to himself, thinking about how reckless the guild that first discovered the herb's potential must have seemed, scraping together everything they had to bet on it. When at that point, the outcome was completely unclear. But they bought up every moonlight herb in the empire, placing a gamble of a lifetime on their guild's future. And thanks to that boldness, they produced something unprecedented, an elixir they dared to call the drink of the gods. They named it nectar. The discovery rocked the empire due to their audacity in naming a mere drug after divine drink. The guild faced blasphemy charges. But once nectar's effects became known, everyone rushed to praise them, and the charges dissolved as if nothing had happened. Because what nectar did was shatter a truth that had stood unbroken for over 1,000 years. That a martial artist's innate realm is determined the moment they are born. That destiny and constitution never change. That this limit is absolute law no one can defy. Nectar broke that law just by drinking it. Even those with zero talent for the sword transformed into useful fighters. Of course, what Lucian is brewing now falls far short of the original's full efficacy. It is a mass-produced version. But for raising a broken body to this extent, there is nothing better available right now. He tells himself to count his blessings that he is a noble young master with the resources to attempt this at all. He also recalls darkly that when nectar later emerged during the chaotic era that swallowed the empire, the alchemist guild that held the recipe was the first thing to burn, because the recipe that shifted the balance of power was considered too dangerous to exist. The recipe vanished from the world entirely. However, Lucian managed to gather clues across his entire previous life and piece together something close to it. He also notes casually that most people who experimented the way he did died from side effects. He glances at the small vial he has prepared, and then, without further ceremony, drinks it down the hatch. The effect is immediate and overwhelming. The narration explains that from this point on, what matters is mana, the way it circulates through the body, how well the process of spreading it throughout one's meridians and retrieving it works. The quality and performance of the power one can draw out differs enormously based on this. Lucian borrowed the power of nectar, specifically to forcibly widen the blocked paths inside his body. Normally, when mana enters a body, it meets resistance, pain, friction, things that must occur, but in Lucian's case, there's none of that. On the contrary, the mana is spreading unhindered, as if finding its rightful place. Even a newborn baby's body usually has pathways blocking proper circulation, but not this one. A single glowing eye watches from somewhere, wide and stunned. The thought that forms is quiet but electric. Don't tell me this guy is the type called a genius? The final image shows Lucian's silhouette suspended in a vast, luminous blue space, surrounded by swirling currents of mana flowing freely around him, limitless, unobstructed, as if the world itself is opening up for him. A few days have passed since Lucian locked himself in his room again. Hans is standing outside the door, anxious, wondering how long his master has been in there and whether anything has happened. He calls out nervously. The door swings open, and Lucian steps out looking perfectly composed. Hans immediately panics. His young master seems completely unchanged on the outside, maybe even the same as before, and Hans has no idea what's been going on in there. He was so worried, and because Lucian gave no notice, he came so close to doing something drastic. Lucian glances at him calmly. His golden eye catches the light. Hans stares and suddenly feels something is different, though he can't pinpoint it. He asks if it's just his imagination, or does the young master feel somehow different? Lucian doesn't answer directly. He thinks to himself that Hans has watched him more closely than anyone else here, so it makes sense he might sense something has changed. But the physical body still needs time and proper nutrition before any external changes would appear. So outwardly, there aren't any major changes right now. What matters is the inside. And on the inside, it is changing at an unbelievable speed. Lucian's innate constitution made it possible, and whatever is watching from the shadows, the observer's stunned thought surfaces again. This guy's potential is in the same league as the legends who changed the world. Lucian cheerfully tells Hans they should go to the market together. He laughs that he's genuinely jealous of Hans sometimes, back in his previous life. He never had nobles like this around him. They head out. The title card appears again, a peaceful scene, the world wide open ahead of them. They walk into a lush forest path leading away from the estate, the atmosphere light and breezy. Lucian breathes it in and marvels at how refreshing it is. Is life allowed to be this easy? He notices his room gets cleaned without him even setting a schedule, everything prepared for him automatically, and thinks warmly that the quality of service is something else entirely. As they walk, he starts thinking. Thanks to being able to focus on his recovery fully, he was also able to address the one thing that had been weighing on his mind. At this point in time, there is someone called Jake, a guard who worked for the Valdek family. Lucian, in his previous life, compared himself to the captain and felt that nobody fit that description back then. He thought it was actually for the best that he didn't go back to his old position, because he didn't have the confidence to face his old self in that role. It would have been an embarrassment, but that's not the real issue. The real concern is Jake's existence specifically at this moment in time. Hans suddenly speaks up, pulling Lucian's attention back to the present. He says that the young master probably doesn't even know this, but the second young master, Geordie, has recently been doing something. Hans reacts with visible unease, just bringing it up. Lucian asks, "Oh, what's he been doing?" Hans explains hesitantly that ever since the second young master sent away the head maid who was looking after Lucian, a rough type has been appearing near his quarters instead. Judging by Hans's reaction, Lucian quickly pieces together the situation. Swordsmanship is a required skill for the children of a Grand Duke. It must have been a perfect opportunity for Geordie. Under the guise of swordsmanship training, he instilled a fear of violence in Lucian to ensure he would never set foot in the training hall again. That was the perfect way to make sure Lucian stayed broken and isolated. Lucian takes this in quietly. He looks at Hans directly and says, "That is all in the past. You just need to trust me and follow my lead." Hans blinks at him. Then Lucian turns and they continue walking. They arrive somewhere that makes Lucian's eyes go wide, a private training facility. He had higher hopes, but even so, the scale of it stuns him. Not only is there ample space to train without worrying about being seen, but it also has magic tools that don't exist even in the most advanced military academies. To think a single individual owns a facility like this. He stands there taking it in, thinking that if he had a place like this back then, things might have looked very different. He shakes it off. Well, he's here now. Wasn't visiting before. Hans tells him proudly, "So, this is really the third young master's? It's such a surprise." Lucian grins. He says he'll have someone lined up to teach him before long, just like a little lamb being chased by a wolf. That last line carries an edge to it. A figure steps out from the shadows of the facility. A rough-looking man with dark, dangerous eyes. He glares at Lucian and says coldly, "So you've finally shown up at this place." His expression is contemptuous. He says it's been a long time. The last time he saw Lucian, he was sent running by the second young master. He sneers, "Do you recall? It was truly an enjoyable time." Lucian stares at him for a moment. Then his golden eyes shift, and a slow, sharp smile spreads across his face. "Look at this little punk. This is going to be fun." Knights, the very embodiment of honor, loyalty, and martial prowess. Most were born into noble families and spent their entire lives preparing for the title. From a young age, they trained in both combat and etiquette. Only after proving themselves through battle, military service, and countless achievements would they finally be recognized as true knights by their liege. But Lucian saw things differently. In the end, many knights were little more than hunting dogs wearing expensive collars. They served their lords, protected their bloodlines, and lived according to the will of the noble families above them. And because of that, the knight standing before him was acting with unbelievable arrogance. The man couldn't hide his contempt. To him, Lucian was simply a worthless noble who had wasted his life. Lucian could tell exactly what the knight was thinking. His low standing within the family certainly played a role, but the knight's confidence came from something else. He believed he had powerful backers supporting him. If it were up to the knight, he would have already fixed Lucian through brutal training methods. But the Grand Duke would never allow something like that. Regardless of personal opinions, a knight was still an important military asset of the Waldeck family. Punishing one without proper procedure would only create unnecessary conflict. For now, the knight restrained himself. Lucian calmly changed the subject. There was no point avoiding the training hall forever just because of what had happened in the past. From now on, he intended to visit frequently. At the very least, he wanted to learn the sword forms. The moment those words left his mouth, the knight burst into laughter. Sword forms? You, according to the knight. Lucian was far too old. Anyone over 15 had already missed their chance. The sword forms were ancient techniques passed down through generations. Simply practicing them allowed warriors to gain enlightenment and strengthen their bodies. But there was supposedly one requirement. The path of mana had to remain open, and according to the knight, that path closed at 16 years old. Without mana, sword forms were meaningless, nothing more than empty movements. A dance. The knight continued mocking him. Perhaps Lucian should become the Empire's greatest dancer instead. Or maybe spend his days gardening. After all, everyone had a role that suited them. The surrounding retainers chuckled. They expected Lucian to stand there speechless, but inside, Lucian almost laughed. The knight's claim was complete nonsense. The path of mana didn't close at 16. In reality, it remained open until around 25. Anyone who spent even a little time researching would know that. Still, the lie had already served its purpose. The knight had achieved exactly what he wanted. Everyone present now saw Lucian as a fool, a weak noble incapable of arguing back, a pathetic worm who couldn't even defend himself from a retainer's insults. Lucian finally spoke, and the words that came out shocked everyone. For some reason, what you're saying is completely different from what I know. The room went silent. Lucian calmly explained that the path of mana closed around 25, not 16, which meant there was absolutely no reason he couldn't begin learning now. The knight's expression immediately stiffened. Trying to regain control of the conversation, he mentioned another name, Jordi Valdec. One of the family's most respected figures, surely Lucian wouldn't dare contradict him as well. But Lucian didn't hesitate, of course. It is such obvious common sense. The knight froze. Lucian pressed forward. Since Jordi had been mentioned, there was no turning back now. According to Lucian, even Jordi supposedly knew this fact. The knight suddenly found himself trapped by his own argument. Lucian dramatically grabbed his head. Hands! It seems the Waldeck family is doomed, the servant nearly panicked. Why was he being dragged into this? Lucian ignored him and continued his performance. How many talented people had lost opportunities because of this false information? How many futures had been ruined? He pretended tears were forming in his eyes. To think his own brother possessed such an empty skull, the knight immediately started sweating. What exactly are you trying to say? But Lucian wouldn't stop. This wasn't merely a mistake. This was a crisis for the entire family. And if the knight had deliberately lied to him, then wasn't that an attempt to deceive the son of his own liege? The accusation hit like a hammer. The knight instantly panicked. He tried to backpedal. No, that's not what I meant. It was just a slip of the tongue. There is no way a knight of the Waldeck family would do something so petty. Lucian immediately seized the opening. Exactly. If that's the case, then this matter is even more serious. The knight felt a chill run down his spine. Lucian's expression turned completely serious. If the knight had merely insulted him, Lucian would have let it go. After all, his poor reputation was partly his own fault. He had wasted years of his life. How could he blame others for looking down on him? But this was different. If knights of the Waldeck family and even his own brother were spreading incorrect knowledge, then they were actively preventing talented people from developing their abilities. That was something he could never ignore. Such misinformation could weaken the military power of the Waldeck Knights. It could endanger the entire territory. It could even threaten the safety of the people living under Waldeck protection. As someone who carried the Waldeck name, Lucian declared that he had every right to be furious. The knight stood there completely stunned. Lucian looked him straight in the eyes. Do you finally understand how serious this issue is? You should prepare yourself, because I intend to request an internal investigation. The knight's face turned pale. Everything had spiraled completely out of control. This was the same Lucian who used to tremble whenever he entered the training hall. The same weak young master everyone mocked. So why was he making such a massive issue out of this? The knight couldn't understand it? Was Lucian always like this? Or had something changed? The man who once seemed as fragile as a baby lamb now felt completely different, almost like an entirely different person. Just then, a new voice interrupted the commotion. What is going on here? Everyone turned toward the entrance. The knight's eyes widened. Perfect timing. The one person he desperately wanted to see had arrived. Standing there was none other than Jordi Valdec. And the moment Jordi laid eyes on Lucian, his expression hardened. It's you again, Lucian Valdec. The training hall fell completely silent. Sir Hendrik immediately panicked. Second young master, I can explain everything. But Jordi Valdec raised a hand and stopped him. There is no need. He had already seen everything with his own eyes, and from what he had witnessed, Lucian's behavior had been nothing short of disgraceful. The atmosphere instantly grew heavy. Even Hans could feel it. Lord Jordi was furious. And unlike Hendrik, Lucian wasn't worried, because he knew exactly who was standing before him. Jordi Valdec, the second son of the Valdec family. A proper noble in every sense of the word. Handsome, talented, respected, and according to Lucian's memories, possessing an absolutely terrible personality. Back when Jordi had served as a guard, he had constantly recruited people to strengthen his influence within the family. But once those people outlived their usefulness, he would discard them without hesitation. Some were framed for crimes, others simply disappeared. Jordi wasn't someone who forgave mistakes, especially not when his pride was involved. Still, Lucian greeted him calmly. Greetings, Brother Jordi. It's been a long time. The polite greeting only seemed to irritate Jordi further. You foolish creature. The insult came immediately. Lucian tilted his head. Pardon? What do you mean by that? Jordi didn't hesitate. He explained that he had witnessed everything that happened between Lucian and Sir Hendrik. And from his perspective, Lucian had tarnished the dignity of the Valdec family. Lucian calmly asked for clarification. Tarnished our dignity? Jordi answered without missing a beat. Sir Hendrik had simply made a mistake due to outdated knowledge. The knight had misunderstood certain theories because he had not studied them in years. But instead of resolving the misunderstanding respectfully, Lucian had used Geordie's name to create confusion and embarrass everyone involved. That alone made him responsible. However, Geordie surprised everyone by saying he had no intention of punishing Hendrik. Unlike Lucian, Geordie understood the knight's loyalty. He knew how much blood Hendrik had shed for the Valdec family, how many battles he had fought, how much he had sacrificed. Then Geordie turned his attention back to Lucian. What right do you have to blame him? You couldn't even endure basic swordsmanship training? You ran away. The words struck like a hammer. Lucian's past failures were well known throughout the family. Geordie continued. Lucian Valdec. You must first learn to respect knights, because Valdec exists thanks to them. The surrounding knights straightened proudly. Geordie then addressed everyone present. He apologized on Lucian's behalf for the disturbance. According to him, the entire incident was merely the mistake of an immature child, and as Lucian's older brother, he would personally take responsibility. He would make sure to educate him properly. Outwardly, it sounded noble, reasonable, even honorable, but Lucian immediately understood what Geordie was doing. He wasn't defending Hendrik. He was protecting his own reputation. The knight had insulted Lucian first. Yet somehow Geordie had twisted the situation into an attack against the knights themselves. In a single speech, he had shielded Hendrik, defended his own authority, and painted Lucian as the villain. His brain works fast. Lucian couldn't help but admit that much. Then a smile slowly spread across his face. Brother, you're absolutely right. Everyone froze. Lucian bowed his head dramatically. According to him, Geordie should have scolded him for insulting his beloved older brother. Instead, Geordie had shown incredible wisdom and generosity. Not only that, he had blessed Lucian with valuable teachings. Teachings that would stay with him forever. Hans immediately sensed danger. The way Lucian was speaking sounded far too familiar, and then Lucian started listing his previous insults, calling Geordie an empty-headed fool, a helmet rack, a man with nothing inside his skull. Hans nearly had a heart attack. Young master, please stop talking, but Lucian ignored him completely. He declared that he was deeply ashamed of his earlier words. So ashamed, in fact, that paper wouldn't be enough to preserve Geordie's wisdom. No, his brother's teachings deserved to be recorded on the finest silk. The surrounding knights struggled to hide their reactions. Some looked away, others clenched their jaws. Even Geordie's expression began twitching. Lucian was praising him, but somehow every word felt like an insult. Inside, Geordie's patience was rapidly disappearing. Meanwhile, Lucian was already planning several steps ahead. He understood Geordie's true goal. Geordie wanted to erase today's embarrassment. He wanted everyone to remember the weak, pathetic Lucian of the past, the coward who ran away from training, the fool who isolated himself for years. If that image remained intact, Geordie could continue controlling the narrative. But Lucian had no intention of allowing that. That version of Lucian no longer existed, and he intended to make sure everyone knew it. Finally, Lucian prepared to leave. There's no point dragging this out, so if you permit it, I'd like to take my leave. Geordie's face darkened. You little, it was obvious he wanted to explode. But Lucian calmly reminded him of something important. Their father had been paying close attention to him recently. If Geordie acted recklessly now, the Grand Duke might notice, and that would create far more problems than today's argument. Lucian shrugged. I have nothing to lose. But you, brother? The meaning was clear. Geordie was the one with political ambitions. Geordie was the one with a reputation to protect. For the first time in the conversation, Geordie found himself cornered. Lucian smiled. I'll take that as your agreement. Then he turned around and walked away. Goodbye, brother Geordie. The moment Lucian disappeared, the tension finally broke. One of the knights nervously approached Geordie. Young master, are we really going to let him leave like this? Geordie said nothing, but the look in his eyes was enough to answer the question. This wasn't over, not even close. Meanwhile, outside the training hall, Hans was on the verge of tears. Young master, will we really be okay? You know Lord Geordie better than anyone. He definitely won't let this go. Hans was convinced they were doomed. At best, Hendrik would seek revenge. At worst, the mustached knight would make them disappear without a trace. Lucian laughed. Calm down. Then his expression softened. For the first time, he thought about what Hans had endured all these years. A servant's life was already difficult, but serving an incompetent master was even worse. Whenever the master made mistakes, the servants paid the price, and Lucian's previous self had made plenty of mistakes. Hans had suffered because of them, more than anyone. Lucian looked directly at him. You've had a hard time because of me. Hans froze. He wasn't used to hearing words like that from his young master. Lucian continued. When the master acts like an idiot, It's always the subordinates who suffer, especially a personal servant. Hands could barely speak, young master. Lucian smiled, then he made a promise. From now on, I won't let my people be ignored. I won't let them live in fear because of my foolish actions. The words struck Hans harder than any threat ever could. For the first time, he felt like he was standing beside a completely different person, a real noble, a real master. Lucian extended his hand. So let's do our best together, Hans. And with that, the two of them walked forward together, unaware that their clash with Jordi Valdec was only the beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this recap and want to see more content like this, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'll be uploading new recaps more frequently, so stay tuned for future releases. Also, if there's a manhwa you'd like to see covered next, let me know in the comments below. I always enjoy hearing your recommendations. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next recap.